welcome to Kells. Right now we're going to start doing a little thing where we're going to start looking at how to apply plaster bandages to make a mold of our hand. First, when you think about the plaster bandages themselves are these little bandages, and you can see that they have lots of holes in them. And it's basically it's plaster that's been sprayed onto a gauze material. And we want that gauze material to stick to our hand, and in order for it to be strong, we've got to activate the plaster. So what we're going to do is dip it in water. We're going to drip off the excess, and we put it on whatever object we're trying to take a mold of, in this case our hand, and we want to rub all of those little holes until they begin to close. So what we want to do is activate the plaster and spread that plaster until it fills as many of those little holes as we can get it to fill. So this way it stays stronger. Now when I'm doing this kind of thing, what I want to do first is I want to make sure I've got my stuff set up. So I want to first get some newspaper or some brown shopping bags put down. Anything that is you can just fold up when you're through and throw the whole thing away. It keeps the place cleaned up and really contains the mess. You're going to need water, so a container for water. You're going to need to cut your plaster. So when you get your plaster, it's going to come in sheets. And what I do is I cut up at least enough to cover my hand 3 times. That's kind of like the minimum that I aim for. And then when I cut it up into, in this case, there were pieces that were double length. I cut them about an inch, inch and a half, and then I cut them in half. They're easier to handle when they're smaller. And then I want to lay them out so that when I go in and I dip, between the water and my hand, I don't have any pieces lying around. And that way I'm not getting them wet, because once they get wet, the clock starts ticking on them and their activation is already happening, and they'll actually start to stiffen up. You might get halfway through the hand, and if you're dripping water over everything, those bandages might be useless by the time you get to them because they will already have activated and stiffened. So we want to make it so that with wet hands I can go in and grab a piece, dip it in the water, and not have to worry about it getting hard along the way. So now the other thing I do is I also put some skin lotion on my hand. The plaster is made of a gypsum material, and gypsum naturally absorbs moisture and oils, so the skin lotion keeps you from drying your skin out. All right, so we're ready to start. We're going to take a mold of our hand. I'm going to do the outside of my hand, and usually I start by setting the perimeter edge of the mold. So I dip the piece in, and I'm going to fold it in half so I have a folded edge, which looks nice, and it also gives me a double layer of plaster material, so it's a nice strong edge right at the outside edge of the piece. So I'm going to go pretty quick with this because we don't have a lot of time with the video. And we're probably going to end before this gets stiff enough to take off. It usually takes about 15 minutes from the time you start to the time it's stiff enough to come off. So I really want to kind of make sure that I've got a nice line with my edge. I don't like to have raggedy things hanging out because afterward it's really hard to trim. So I'm trying to make sure I get a nice line there. You know, unlike paper mache, where you can take a pair of scissors to it and trim all the rough stuff off at the end, with plaster, it's quite a bit harder and it does not trim well. So pretty much the shape that you end with is the shape that you have to deal with. So I'm just going to keep adding stuff on here. And I'm trying to build that edge all the way around. once I finish building the edge, then I'm just going to start filling in the middle. And you'll notice that I keep going back and re-rubbing those holes closed. Now, I'm doing my own hand. You could do someone else's hand. You could teach someone else to do your hand. I find it's way easier to work with someone else than it is to try and work by yourself. It's not always possible. So right now I'm working by myself. But if you've got a parent or a sibling that's willing to work with you, it could really make life easier, especially when we get into projects down the line, because you're going to be doing 3 projects where you can use this as the medium. And when we get into the face mask project, it's way easier if someone else takes your mold than if you're trying to take it all by yourself. It's doable. It's doable. Just a lot more challenging. So here we go. I'm almost through with the edge. Just have to get back to that side. Now I am overlapping pieces so that they have more strength. And now I'm ready to start filling in. So when I fill in, I usually go in like one direction. So I'll start going up and down my hand, and then as I go to the next layer, I'll go crosswise. And that'll give me a lot more strength. Now, a big part of the strength is that we fill all these holes. If the holes don't fill in, it means that the plaster is not being activated completely. And if you just kind of get it wet and slap it on there and you don't rub those little holes until they fill, quite often your plaster is not very strong and it can crumble as you're taking it off. And that would be a little distressing after spending that kind of time and effort. I'm really trying to get it into those creases. So basically, I'm just going to keep on adding. And once I get to a point where I can start changing direction for the second layer, that's when I'm going to really start getting a really nice strength and hardening piece. So this is just going to keep going on. This is just a time-consuming portion. And I would keep going, and I'm going to keep going. So now, I would normally keep covering the whole thing before changing direction, but we're not going to spend our whole time doing that. So now I'm going to change direction here, and I'm going to start, and this is where I really want to make sure those holes are filled in, because this is what's going to bond this layer to the layer underneath it. And if I can see the color of my hand through it, it means I probably need either to rub the holes more, or I also need to think about another layer. So right now I'm working on my second layer here, and it should probably have 3 layers to be strong enough. So I would continue on with that, and once I get it stiff enough, you know, where I've covered the whole thing, it takes it about 5 minutes by the time you finish it till it's stiffen enough where you can actually start taking your hand out. I usually start to stretch the skin, and you'll feel it'll start to get really kind of crunchy, and you'll be able to start to do things like pull out But if the idea is you don't want to do that unless if you pull out and the plaster moves with your finger, it's not ready. So give it a little more time. When it is, it's going to be nice and stiff. And after it dries and hardens overnight, so you can actually hear it. So it actually makes a nice sound. And it gets really rigid and stiff, and it's really kind of strong. And you'll see that this is where having that folded edge gives it a real nice finished look when it's all set. So as you're working with this, just keep in mind it's dipping it. You want to drip as much water off as you can. When you apply it, you want to give it a good chance for the layers to stick together by rubbing all of those little tiny holes until they fill with plaster evenly all the way through the layers. And you can even go back towards the end and go over everything one more time just to give it that little extra strength. So I'm going to keep working. You guys, you know enough now to get going. Thanks for watching Kells, and good luck with your hand project.